Hi everyone, this is my review of Napoleon Invades Spain. It is the Peninsular War Part 1, published by the Operational Studies Group and part of the Library of Napoleonic Battles. You basically get 4 different battles, and they can be combined to create a campaign where you're playing each of the battles consecutively. The 525 yards per hex, 1 hour per turn, 400 to 800 men for each strength point. Game design is Kevin Zucker, and graphic design is Charlie Kibler and Christopher Moeller. I hope I've pronounced your surname correctly. And you get 2 full colour 22 by 34 maps and 2 11 by 17. So basically you get 2 what I call standard size wargame maps and 2 smaller ones. And each of the battles takes place on one of those maps. So the game's battles are all 1 map battle. So you don't need a huge amount of space to play through the game. You get a scenario book, which we'll have a look at, a rule book, which we'll have a look at, 2 counter sheets, and a whole bunch of player aids that I'll talk through. The counter sheets are sort of a mixture of gameplay counters and unit counters, and we'll have a look at some of those as well. So the rule book, this is version 7.34 of the rules. It is a series rules, so if you're not familiar with the series, basically once you've learnt the rules of the series, you can approach any of the games, and each one will have its own scenario book, for example, that may have some additional rules and etc. And it presents itself as an historical simulation game system. It's full colour, as you can see. It's sort of printed on a nice thick paper, I would describe it as. Full colour. We have a sequence of play. Sequence of play is pretty straightforward, I would say. Each scenario will tell you who plays in what order. I think every scenario, every battle, it's the French player always goes first. Zones of control, super important in this game. Stacking as well, so there's not huge stacks. Basically you can have, basic stacking is 2 combat units if they're of the same division. You can have 3, and then if you have a leader, you can have 5. There are 3 types of leader: commanders, officers, and commander officers. We'll talk about how the sort of leader and the command system works when we have a look at the game laid out. But it's an interesting command system, and it is absolutely integral to the game. Movement is pretty straightforward if you're familiar with hex counter war games. Not too. There is road marches, so you can take benefit of the movement on roads. There are rules for hidden forces. It doesn't detract from playing the game solo, I didn't find. You can basically have a stack of units or counters, and then even when I played the game solo, I've done this, and just don't look at the stack. So in theory you know what's there, but the reality is you probably forget the finer detail. It's more relevant to a 2-player game. Repulse system is when you can repulse the enemy in the when you're doing movement, but you will need odds of 5 to 1 or greater. Combat, I'll talk a lot about combat when we have a look at the CRT and the results of combat. You can advance after combat. Retreat, I'll talk a lot about retreat and the importance of getting the retreat rules correct. So it's nicely written. I didn't have any problems understanding the rules reading the rule book. It's not terrible. It's sort of, I would put it in the grand scheme of wargaming or hex and counter wargaming. I'd put it sort of medium complexity. Cavalry, again, pretty straightforward. Fortified. Supply is super important. especially the supply source hex, which we'll talk more about when we look at the game laid out. And again, same with reinforcements, march orders, recovery and reorganisation, demoralisation is interesting how they do that. And we'll have a look at that when we look at the player aids. So yeah, not a huge number of pages, 22, 23 pages of rules, and a very nice table of contents on the back to help you when you're playing the game get into the relevant section. I would describe the rules. Obviously, this is version 7.34. It's a long-standing rule system. It's gone through iterative development, and you can tell. Like I said, I didn't have any problems. I have played other games in the system, so I use this rulebook as a sort of a refresher, I would describe, and found the rules very nicely written, nicely edited, very clear. There are some examples in there as well, which is which is great. So yeah, very tidy rulebook I would describe. This is basically the scenario book or the study folder. It's the historical design notes. Basically tells you everything that you, and this is version 2.0, basically informs you of everything that you need to know of how to set the scenario, how the scenarios will play out. So in terms of their setup and rules and so forth. So you've got information telling you what forces on what scenarios, and we'll have a look at the player aid for how you set those up in a second. Any of the specifics to any of the scenarios, so peninsula specific rules such as around night combat and weather, etc. And guerrillas. I should probably point out that in this video I probably won't be talking about using the cards. Cards, in my opinion, are an optional mechanic. The game doesn't come with any. If you have them, you can use them if you want, but the game doesn't come with them. But it's an optional mechanic. It talks about victory conditions, how you work those out, levels of victory, etc. Again, very nicely written, clearly laid out. Then we're into the actual the battles themselves. And for the most part, I'll say you have, for each battle, you have 2 scenarios. You have the day of battle, and then you have what's called the approach to battle. And then you have for example, on this one, you have a hypothetical French free setup option as well. Depends on how many turns you want to play as to which battle, when you're picking a battle, which version you want to be playing. So for example, this battle here is 9 turns. If you were to play the approach to battle version, it would be 12 turns. So for example, and again, it's they're nicely laid out, very clear. Never had too many problems with these. As I said before, the game does come with 4 standalone battles. Then you can play the campaign game, where you are playing those battles in order, and the days, as it quotes, with each day's fighting influencing the number of bonus cards you get. So there's that if you want to do that. Then we're into the historical notes, which are very nicely written. It's quite interesting. Like any sort of Napoleonic game, the more research or the more reading you do, the more informed you are as to when you're playing through the game, the more certain things make more sense, in my opinion. These are good. Enjoyed reading these. Bibliography is great. And then you are... I've got a few books on the Peninsular War. I'm reading a book at the minute from the sort of French perspective, which is quite interesting. And then you're into design notes. So again, nicely done, very straightforward. Back of you get some of the tables. We'll have a talk about the tables separately as we look at the player aids. So these player aids inform you of what counters to use on the various battles. This is the Spanish armies sheet. You also have sheets for the French and for the British as well. Tells you the unit name, their division, their type, their stats, how many men were involved, the number of artillery guns, for example, and then tells you the hex that you'll be placing them on, depending on the scenario, the battle you've chosen, and if they're reinforcements or not. Plus you get a composition details as well. It is an excellent player aid, and as I was setting the games up, I was looking at these, and it's quite interesting. It's quite a lot more information than you would normally find, historical information. Some of it is, it's just interesting to know from a historical point of view. And so, I really appreciate the detail and effort going into these sheets. You'll also get one of these per battle. So this is your turn track for both sort of versions of the battle, depending if you want to play the shorter turn battle or you want to play sort of the longer. And it will tell you, again, you'll be able to put your reinforcements on here as well. Very clear. It's worth pointing out that some of the turns are at night, and there are specific rules around night turns. So, for example, night march here on that turn there. You also get for each nation, you'll get a casualty record track. And this is important because depending on the formations, depending on the scenario, etc., as you take casualties, when that does happen, you'll be placing those counters on this track. I place them on the track. You also have another counter to represent those that you can place on the track. Now, with casualties, what can happen, depending on the circumstances of the casualty, it can be, and dice rolls, etc., you can bring casualties back into the game. So you use another player aid for that. So you have these full strength holding boxes where whether they're reduced, it depends on the circumstances. So they can be awaiting recovery and they can go back onto the board or not. It depends on a few different factors. But you get a player aid for that as well. You also get some player aids for the cards. So Fog of War, sort of details, specifics about cards, etc. if you want to use them. Cards, as I mentioned, in my opinion, are purely optional. And rules about the cards. There you go. Very nicely done. And more stuff about cards. Then we've got our victory worksheet. So if you want to keep a track of for the campaign, you can use this weather table, which does have some, as you'd imagine, gameplay orientated to it. So when you're rolling for weather, which you do every day, top of my head without double checking, there are tables for that. And then before we talk about combat, we have terrain, and the terrain player aid fits into two categories. One is you've got one sheet for the effects on combat. So for example, you can see defending infantry get 1.5 times their strength when defending in a town hex, for example. And then you also get the terrain effects on movement as well. So you can see the movement costs for the various different types of terrain, and is for the most part pretty straightforward, I would say. Nicely done, nicely laid out, very clear. Having played all the battles several times, use these player aids extensively, no problems whatsoever. Very, very straightforward to use. So the last player aid I'm going to talk about and have a look at is the combat tables. And there is no doubt in the game there's a lot of player aids. So when you're laying the game out, you need a little bit of room, not just the map, because there are quite a few player aids, as we've seen, that you will be using if you're not playing with the cards, you use less. But even so, you still need different player aids to hand, and I put some of them under plexi. So it is you definitely get a good number of player aids, and they're all incredibly useful. The last player aid I want to talk about is a combat table. So combat is it's a ratio, probability ratio, exactly as you would expect. Very, very similar to any hex encounter war game that you'll be familiar with. The things that are, I'm not going to say unique, but that strike you when you're first learning the game is the impact of the combat, the results of the combat of a CRT. So if we have a look at a 1-to-1 odds, so where the attacker has the same strength as the defender, and it's a d6, we can see that defense are 2, defense are going to retreat 2 on a 1, and on a 6 the attackers are going to retreat 2. And then we've got a shock table result, which is another table that you'll roll on if you get that result. And it's every single result is basically either the defender retreating or the attacker retreating. And if we have a look at 3-to-1 in favour for the attacker, the defender is retreating every single option apart from shock. So the defender is going to retreat either 1 hex or 2 hexes or 3 hexes apart from shock. And it's not until we get into a 4-to-1 odds that there's a 1 in 6 chance of an exchange. And so the reality is, when you're playing the game, is that most of the results of combat are going to be one side or the other retreating, with no casualty, no step loss, or anything like that. And it's the same is true with the shock combat table. So this is a result of this, depending on if you get a shock combat. And there's some other nuances to it, but predominantly if you get a shock combat, you'll then be rolling on the shock combat table. And for the most part, again, it's attacker retreating or defender retreating. There is a result for a step loss, but for the most part, it's one side or the other retreating. Now this is important, this idea of predominantly the results of the combat table are going to be the attacker retreating, or more likely the defender retreating, if I'm being honest. The reality of playing the game. Now, this is with very little step losses from combat based on the CRT. Now there's 2 really, really important rules in the rulebook that make that results of that CRT, which on first glance looks odd, but it's important that there's 2 things I want to talk about. Number 1, if a unit cannot retreat fully, it is eliminated. If any part of its retreat path is blocked by an EZOC or the map edge, the unit is placed in the unit's awaken recovery box. Basically means it's taken out of the game. It might be able to come back on. And second thing, so basically what this rule is saying is that if the unit cannot retreat based on the results of the retreat, so you get a result, the defender has to retreat. If it cannot retreat, it's eliminated. And if it retreats into an EZOC, it's eliminated. And the second thing that's really important here is the path of retreat. Let me just move the... You probably won't be able to see this on the camera, but I'll talk about it. Okay. The retreat should shorten the distance to the formation's baggage train or to a friendly supply source. And the first time you go, yeah, okay, yeah, whatever. But most war games, you're retreating to the edge of the map that's relevant to that force. But here you have to retreat to a shortened distance to the supply source, and that in practice makes the retreat path absolutely critical. Now those two things combined, so you have to retreat to your resource, to your supply source, and if you cannot retreat, if anything's stopping you, so you can't retreat across a river or whatever, for example, and if you can't do those things, then you are eliminated. And it's those sort of combination of those mechanics. So if we have a look, I'm going to have to move the mic, and I apologise for that. If we have a look here at the terrain effects, and we have a look at the movement, for example, the unit is prohibited from moving across a destroyed bridge, and there are destroyed bridges. The unit is prohibited from moving across a river hex side, for example. So if you push the enemy across the river, they're eliminated. They are eliminated because they can't move across the river. If you push an enemy into an EZOC, it's eliminated. So even though the results of the combat table don't have a lot of step losses or eliminations, what you find through play is that they're eliminated through the environment they're in being pushed into, if that sort of makes sense. And it's a key part of the game. So this is one of the smaller maps that you get in the game. You get two of these, and then you get two larger maps. And we'll have a look at one of those after we've had a look at this. I've got it set up for one of the scenarios, one of the battles. The map artwork I think is absolutely great. It's very clear, the contents of the hex. You have to be attentive to especially things like the hex sides, and sometimes the counters are going to obscure the contents of the hex, especially when you get the little stacks. So you've got to get in there and move things about to have a look at the contents of the hex. But it's very clear. The visual language is very easy to understand and is very consistent. And aesthetically, I think the maps are very, very pleasing to the eye. They have a nice complementary style to the historical period. Plus, I really appreciate the attentiveness to some of the detailing that has no gameplay impact, but has an interesting impact from a historical point of view. So location, names, and so forth. And I think the game greatly benefits from that. I think it's one of the things I like about the game a lot, is that it does feel, I have not checked this map against a map of the period, but it feels very authentic and very detailed from a historical point of view. And I always appreciate that from historical games. So yeah, I think the map looks great. So if we have a closer look at the counters, again, the counters are very easy to read. They have a few statistics that are important for gameplay, such as the movement and their sort of strength value, and the contents of the counter, so artillery, foot, horse, some cavalry here, and are very aesthetically pleasing. They're sort of colour coded to their formation. I'll call it formation, or their division, really, I suppose. And they're again very consistent. They are, and even because the actual counters are, I'm a tweezer person, so the counters are quite small, but still there's a nice big font on the numbers that matter, I would say. And they're very nice. They're nicely done. They punch out nicely. I've clipped mine. They look great. I think they look great. And it's very clear. And it's very clear the opposing sides and everything. It just is a nice, really pleasing aesthetic to this game. I think the game looks great on the table. And again, it's very usable, very functional. Yeah, I think honestly, I think it's with all the maps and counters and scenarios, I've always felt this is a good looking game on the table. So this is one of the two larger maps, physically larger maps. And again, it follows that same sort of graphical visual styling of the map artwork. And again, it's very clear the contents of the hex. It's very easy to read. It's very user friendly, very usable. And as you can see on the bottom of the map over there, we've got a key, which is very useful. The other thing that's probably worth mentioning here at this point is that, as you can see, there's not a huge amount of units, not a huge amount of counters on the board. So we've got some French counters here, some Spanish counters over here and there. And there are for sure some reinforcements, but not a huge volume, very small number really. And this is probably a series of battles in this game where there's not a huge amount of counters. It's not like there's stacks and stacks and stacks of counters all on the map or vying for position. This game in the series, this historical period isn't like that at this scale. And the other thing that's probably worth mentioning is that they don't take long to play the battles. This battle here that we've got set up, you could probably play this it's certainly in an evening. Those smaller battles, in terms of the physically smaller map that I showed previously, you could probably play that twice in an evening, which is quite an interesting thing to do, to play it once, then try out some different techniques, and straight away get back into it and play that way. So these are not big games in terms of the amount of hours it's going to take to play. As you can see here, as I said, there's some Spanish units there and here. Got some objectives in these positions here. So there's a lot of movement in the game. There's a lot of marching. There's a lot of moving within the environment. And it's very spacious because it's not a huge number of counters. I mean, as you can see, the French, it really isn't. And when you start making them into stacks, it's really not. It's a quite quick playing game, and that definitely has its place. And it has its place to play a Napoleonic battle that you can play in an evening. And this box set is definitely that. I don't think any of the battles has taken me more than an evening, or if you wanted to play it over a couple of evenings, absolutely, you could do that too. In fact, actually, you can rest the game quite easy and come back to it very straightforward to do so. So in terms of what you will actually be doing while you're playing the game, which is how I like to think about the games that I play, you will be moving your troops, moving your units, marching them, as we can see here with these French. You will be bringing in some reinforcements, though not many. You will be forming stacks, and there's an advantage to having what I would call combined arms, or where you've got infantry, artillery and horse all in the same stack. You'll be activating commanders and officers and so forth. Some of them you'll be needing to roll to determine if they activate, if you can actually do something with them or not. It's all very straightforward. It's got quite a nice command system, although it's very on-off. So let's say we need to roll for this formation here, this division, whatever, and we need a 3. And if you don't get it, they don't do anything. Simple as that. If you do get it, you can do the things you want to do. So there'll be times when you're playing the game that you're not going to be able to do everything you would want to do. That's down to the die rolls. There'll be other times when you'll do everything you need to, and that can make a massive influence on the battle. You'll be forming, as I said, small stacks, stacks of 5 or 6 counters maximum, and you'll be moving into position using the EZOC rules. So you're stopping when you move into an EZOC. You'll be doing artillery barrages from distance, hex to hex combat, and you'll be pushing each side will be pushing backwards and forwards. What you'll need to do is move your other units into position so that you can effectively use that those rules around the EZOC to your advantage, or pushing the enemy into across a hex side or whatever, and pushing them out of objectives. It is, in my opinion, of the battles, it's a very much a defense and attacking type scenario situation for the battles for the most part. Most of the time, I would say there are some counter attacks you can do, and actually I played this particular scenario once, and it was quite interesting sort of situation that occurred in here as the French were trying to push, and some bad die rolls, and the Spanish were able to push them out. That was quite interesting, and it all from a understanding of the mechanics point of view, all is fairly straightforward to understand. Like I said, you've got to, especially if you're used to playing hex and counter games, you've got to spot the things that make this game different. And I would, like I've pointed out, some of the rules around the EZOCs and around some of the not the CRT, but what it actually means, and that there's resource, the supply points, for example. And yeah, that's it is a from a mechanics point of view. I found the game. I haven't played the game for a while, or this series for a while. Sorry, fairly straightforward to get back into. I'll be honest. So some concluding thoughts. What I liked about the game, I like all the components. I like the historical detail. I like the fact you get 4 battles. They're all quite quick to set up and play. You can play each one in an evening comfortably. That has its place for me in my Napoleonic game collection for sure. I also like massive games with multiple maps that take days and days and days to play. But I do like having that choice as a gamer. I like all the play raids. I like the fact the game's easy to set up and play. I like the fact that the rules and the scenario books are interesting, some historical detail, very straightforward. As a package, I feel, and the game was fairly expensive, I will be honest, but I felt as a package, I enjoyed the game experience, and I've had fun playing each battle set multiple times now, both the actual the day of battle and the longer scenario as well, and I really enjoyed that. I would say the mechanics. There have definitely been times when I've been playing the game and I enjoy the mechanics because I'm learning, or in my case, refreshing how the game works, playing those mechanics and get satisfaction from understanding the mechanics and then putting them into action onto the game. That is part of the satisfaction of playing war games for sure. And there have been times where I have, and I'll be honest, have kind of thought, does this feel that Napoleonic? Does this fit with the image I have in my head as to how the battles were fought and the actions of the men involved? That's a very personal thing because everyone's individual understanding of this period of history will differ slightly. And I can see there were times I can see why some people feel the same way. But in saying that, I still enjoyed the game. The one thing that's interesting with this game series, and this is about the series as much as it is about this game, is that you can play the game with the rules out of the box. You can play with the game with the rules out of the box without the cards, and they add quite an interesting dimension to the game. Entirely up to you. And there are alternative rule sets completed by different designers for the game series. So as the player, you have quite a few options to you as to what rule set you use. Play with one rule set, see how that goes. Play with a different rule set, see which one is better suited to you as an individual, as to your expectations and enjoyment you get from the game. And there aren't many, in the grand scheme of the wargaming hobby, there aren't too many games that I can think of where those choices exist like that. And it's quite an interesting part of the hobby for example, how I play most games is I read the rules, I play the game to the rules, to my understanding of the rules, I will hasten to add, and I, for the most part, enjoy those rules and play that game and enjoy them or not, etc. The game's done. Back in the box it goes on the shelf until the next time I choose to play it. But for this game series is a little different. For this game series, I found myself playing the game and thinking, you know what? I might let the units that were not activated, they didn't take their die roll, I might let them move a hex instead. I might think that might make a bit more sense to me. Why would they still be stood there stationary? Would they, etc., etc. So I found myself naturally bringing in some home rules into the game. And this I found with this game series, I've done that in the past more and more and more, and I've tried the different alternative rule sets and taken bits from those and bits from the original rules and sort of splurged them together. Now that is not for everyone. I understand totally that for most people, or for a majority of people, or it doesn't matter if the majority or not, for a lot of gamers, they want the rules as is, play the game to the rules. I totally understand that. But I think it is a part of this game series, and you only have to go to BGG to see that in the comments about the game series. Some people prefer the alternative rules, some people prefer the rules that come in the box. And I think from a gamer's perspective, from a consumer's perspective, it's great that exists, but it's not for everyone. And I think that's an important part of this game. The other thing I think is important is, like I said, the game price tag here in the UK is getting towards the top end of what I would be prepared to pay for a war game. And I think that is a consideration. I feel I got value for money because I've really enjoyed myself playing these series of battles multiple times now over the course of the last few weeks. I have really enjoyed, and it's a testament, I think, that I played one battle, finished the battle, and got straight away. I want to play that again. I'm going to do this bit different. I'm going to see how this works, and then maybe I'll tweak this rule, and I'm straight back into it. And I enjoyed it as much, if not more, the second time around. So it's one of the things I love about the hobby is that how you can lose yourself in a game system, both the history, the drama of the battle, and the mechanics of the game. So I love all that. So because I enjoyed it so much, I would say if you're interested in Hex Encounter Napoleonics, this is, if you're familiar with Hex Encounter games, I'm not sure I would consider this an introductory game by any stretch of the imagination. Now there is an interesting point with this game series, not with this game, but there is an introductory game that's available. I don't have it, so I can't comment on it. My understanding of that is that it's one battle, I think on one of the smaller maps, and I think you have to download some of the rules or maybe some of the charts, I'm not entirely sure. But you can try the game out, the system out, for a much more modest price than having to spend a lot of money for one of these box sets. So that could be an option for people as well. At some point I probably should get that and talk about it and see what I think to that. It's an introduction to the game system. But I think that overall, if you're interested in Napoleon Hex Encounter, if you play other Hex Encounter war games, I think this is an interesting game. I think it has lots of things going for it. I think one of the things is that once you learn the rules, regardless of what rule set you're using, whether you're using the cards or not, regardless of all those things, there are multiple games in the collection, so you can learn one rule set and play tons and tons and tons and tons of Napoleonic battles, and that's, there's a lot to be said for that. So I've enjoyed it, and I think I just wanted to sort of talk a bit about those elements of the game, really. So I hope that was interesting. I hope that was informative. I hope that helps you understand if you think this game is for you in your purchasing decisions. Like I said, overall, I've enjoyed it. I've played all the alternative rules. I enjoyed parts of them. I enjoyed parts of the original rules. I have done my thing with it, and that's how I enjoyed playing it. But I would still say the original rule set is, for most, I can see how for a lot of people will be very satisfactory. the key thing for me for these types of war games, as is true for a lot of things in when we think about board games, is number one, you've got to have fun and you've got to enjoy it. Now, what that means is very personal. You know, for me, it's the losing myself in the history, losing myself in the narrative of the battle, losing myself in the mechanics of the game. That's what I enjoy, and this game series has all of that. You might, for me, I've just had to put a bit more work into it compared to some other games. So I hope that was interesting. I hope that was useful. And thanks a lot for watching, as ever. Thank you.